Welcome to the Heretic's Guide to GemStone. This is a historical exploration series for the massively multiplayer text-based game GemStone IV. I'm your host, the player Zorus. In this episode, I will do something a little different and explore the geography of the world of Elanthia. More specifically, I wish to answer the question, is the world round or flat? So, spoiler alert, the world is round. End of story. Now you do not need to watch or listen to the rest of the episode. You know the final answer. Okay, so let's do the 100 disclaimers you always have to do with this stuff. GemStone is a fictional world. The game masters have the sole power to say what's true or not. They even have the power to make self-contradictory lore. Your internal consistency logic arguments be damned. What else? You're free to roleplay whatever you want. No one is gatekeeping you for being a Flat Elanthia conspiracy theorist. Blah, blah, blah. I'm just some guy on the internet. I do not know the authorial intent. It's just a game. Give the GMs a break on unexplained gaps and things not adding up right. You get the idea. But if you're an actual real-life flat earther, I can see nothing. Nothing. Not an inch. I'm going to Neil deGrasse Tyson on you. The computer you're using right now is based on physics that make a flat Earth impossible. So actual flat earthers should not watch this video. I'm just going to piss you off. Now, that being said, Elanthia is round. It's not really in question. But suppose you were very contrary, an Elanthian flat earther. This is a fantasy world setting, you might say. Maybe things work differently in Elanthia. You don't know. You aren't the boss of me. Who is to say the world is not a flat disk held up by a stack of turtles? Maybe it's magic, you say. Anything is possible because of magic. Let's table the magic for a bit. What kind of game is GemStone? Well, GemStone isn't all that consistent on what genre it wants to be or what historical periods it reflects. Loosely speaking, it's going for something like late medieval European Renaissance through some enlightened despotism, some feudalism without ever getting terribly specific on what that really means in practice, but also people wearing Victorian clothing sometimes, some occasional steampunk stuff, some Japan with the Erythians, some North Africa with the Tahirs, some sprinkles of stuff from other places. Add some Tolkien-esque D&D fantasy races, some Lovecraft, some stuff that's really too modern for the world setting because the people playing it are 21st century humans, and that's roughly what GemStone is doing. But Earth has been widely known to be round for thousands of years. Nobody thinks Elanthia is a Bronze Age world setting, not the major civilizations at least. But then you double down on it, committed to your perverse arguments. Where does it explicitly say the world is round? Well, that runs into a more subtle issue, doesn't it? We mostly do not have OOC documentation, canon with the status of metaphysical truths that transcend the world setting. Even if a lore document asserted the world was round, that would only speak to the beliefs of NPCs. There are a few exceptions to that, but they are few and far between. GM statements, vignettes, storyline epilogues, the Caramon document, the occasional rare OOC note or mechanics information. And even then, you have to scale its authority, like the Ildren Officiality Index. I'll mention a few such things, but it's not the norm. The norm is within universe information. So we can split the matter into three separate categories. The first would be GM statements and anything that has the appearance of being OOC information. The second would be in-character representations and recognition of spherical worlds. The third would be physical evidence for the round world. It's probably not going to come out that clean, but that's roughly how I will split it up. It's interesting to see if you can determine this stuff from the available information, but it's also interesting to ask what the understanding is within Elanthia. What do they know in Elanthia, and how do they know it? There's the related question of whether the NPCs have a geocentric or heliocentric view of the cosmos. That is, do the celestial bodies revolve around Elanthia, or do planets orbit the sun? There is the added wrinkle that the other planets are ill-defined. In GemStone, at least. They're more defined in DragonRealms, which is another matter. So I'll be exploring the lore documents as well as the room painting. I do not want to get too deep into the weeds with physics. I will to some extent at one point, but I'm going to go light on the math. Maybe in some future video we can go hard on physics. I don't know who would actually watch that, but we could do it. But this would not be much of a historical exploration series without setting it all into some historical context. With GemStone, we always have to be careful to keep track of when things were created or first established. The most severe case of this would be the Ice Age parts of the game that still exist. The world setting, after all, was different before 1996. Then the names of things, such as the moons or continents, were mostly changed to fancy new words. But not just new words. The history timeline and world map were completely different. But then there was some delay on replacing all of that archaic information. The Elanthian Moons document, for example, was released in summer 2002. The mechanical day-night system was very early 2002. That's a 6-year gap. So I'll be using Shadow World as a point of contrast to Elanthia, but also with DragonRealms. DragonRealms was intended to be the same Elanthia as GemStone, except set further in the future. They tried to keep things consistent, but now there are major inconsistencies. The more you look at it, the less sense it makes, but it's worth at least looking at it. Let's start by considering the OOC stuff, the Word of God, GameMaster statements, that kind of thing. In DragonRealms, I think I have seen the same post from a GM stating Elanthia is round. You might have to take my word for it, it's a needle in a haystack. But here's a room description of theirs quoted on one of their wiki pages saying, the latitude and altitude anywhere in this hemisphere of Elanthia. It's a very OOC thing that isn't the sense perception of the player character. The world dragon myth over there, of course, is that the world dragon was put to sleep in the center of Elanthia, which is providing the interior of the planet with heat, and the world would be destroyed if it woke up. That whole premise, even as a myth, makes no sense with the Flat Elanthia. There are certainly I.C.E. representations of Elanthia spherical in DragonRealms, but that isn't what we're talking about at the moment. They also have a lot of astronomy stuff for moon mages that involves Elanthia being spherical. You can see the seasonal chart of sunrise and sunset time changes over their year. GemStone is just mirroring Earth time. DragonRealms is using artificial time. So this shifting was directly, intentionally coded into DragonRealms. That isn't what we're talking about at the moment either. That falls under empirical evidence. In GemStone, I was once able to get GM scribes to say on the forums that his half-Krovan colonies document was implying Elanthia was round. So you can see a screen capture of that saved post here. Here's the 1996 map of northwestern Elanth that was made by now former GM Banthus. The bottom of it has his attribution. It says the northwestern hemisphere. Maps can usually be taken as I.C., but that's clearly an OOC label. Hemispheres are not flat. This is actually a modified satellite image of the north coast of Australia. It's just rotated 90 degrees counterclockwise. The Gulf of Carpentaria closely resembles the Ice Age region map, so it was used as the de-iced version of Darkstone Bay. What we're now calling the Lycerian Hills was originally this northern peninsula, but that wasn't kept consistent. Terrace Isle is Timor. Rune Creek is New Guinea, though Rune Creek did not exist in 1996. The Great Barrier Reef is west of Icemeal. Solhaven is down near Darwin, Australia, which is about 2,000 kilometers away from the Great Barrier Reef. So that's the scale of the image itself, but as a GemStone map, it has no distance scaling. That's roughly the scaling of the Ice Age map, but the bay wasn't as wide north-south. Glavalveln isn't on this map, which is meaningless. It could be hand-waved as being underneath the label Darkstone Bay, but really it's just that Australia has no big enough analog of that island. With the recent retcon, we could say it is further north. What else? There are quite a few messages, whether rune painting or spells, that refer to the world's core. One is the other alignment for the cleric spell Divine Wrath. What kind of relevance that has is dubious at best. In more purely I.C. terms, the phrase core of the world appears in the History of Elementals and Griffin Sword War documents. I'll talk more about lore documents later because those are generally I.C. world setting information. It also appears in the lore song of a shard of the Theodrakis, which can be read as either an I.C.E. concept of the lore singer or invoking an OOC property about the world, or possibly invoking a real-world concept of the reader that has nothing to do with Elanthia. Lore songs can be kind of ambiguous in that way. Here's a room in the coastal cliffs from 1991 that, looking down, says, "You catch a glimpse of what must surely be the center of Elanthia." That's old room design that intrusively tells you what you're thinking or feeling. It is similar to the lore song ambiguity I just mentioned in that way. But that one is strictly speaking from the Ice Age, which is not the same world setting as today. It would have said the center of Colthea originally, so using that one is kind of cheating. Let's back up and look at the Ice Age setting from the first half of GemStone III, when the world setting was called Colthea instead of Elanthia. I want to do this because the game was originally made in this context, and back then this world setting stuff was much more explicitly defined in an OOC way than it is today. Colthea means Shadow World in the archaic language of Heretic. I might use either of those terms interchangeably. So the solar system and astronomy are objectively defined for Colthea, which is partly a science fiction setting. This information comes from source books intended for use by game masters. It is supposed to be objectively correct, regardless of what NPCs or PCs think. Over 100,000 years ago, there was a highly technologically advanced race called the Lords of Essence. Lords of Essence do not exist in the Elanthia world setting. This excerpt is describing one of their data records. This is actually the speaking crystal Bander Etrovion was caught trying to steal in the background story of the landing's graveyard. As you can see here, which is a record of their scientists discovering the essence, what we call mana. It was framed as a universe of physical laws, but there's a kind of foreign energy seeping into this universe through an interdimensional rift next to Colthea. This energy is only known to exist in the vicinity of Colthea. It's like a background radiation, but in some ways flows like a fluid, which is called the flows of essence. And the manipulation of this energy allows the temporary deviations of physics that we call magic. This is significant because GemStone was originally designed in this framework. Similar concepts exist in the cosmology and magic theory of DragonRealms. Magic was not willy-nilly or free-form wish fulfillment. Things are not arbitrarily possible because magic. The world follows the laws of physics except for situations where the physics of other universes is involved. There are limits to what magic can accomplish. It isn't trivial to make some new magic work. Individuals are scale limited in how much magical power they can wield. They cannot transfer it with perfect efficiency, something like a second law of thermodynamics, entropy. There's a kind of conservation of energy to what we call mana, a first law of thermodynamics. Mana crystals, for example, drain the mana from regions, which means it is finite. Mana can also be infused and concentrated into places. That's all really deeply encoded in our magic system, which was directly based on Rolemaster spell law, which is a pretty complicated subject. It's a really subtle and advanced lore issue. You can be glib and give the pat answer. That old stuff is archaic. It doesn't matter. We aren't bound to it. If I were on staff, I'd probably be saying something like that too, because dabblers with the lore do not handle that information the right way. They take it and try to use it like it's all still current. So it's simpler to act like it has no relevance at all. In a way that is true, but it's superficial. We still have documentation on the Play.net website, for example, including a lot of our spells that are originally copy and paste out of Rolemaster spell law. There are parts of Rolemaster character law, arms law, and so on that if you've read it, you'd say, oh, I know this. This is just GemStone. Most of the stuff that already existed in the game was kept pretty similar and consistent with what they were originally. It's everything else that was not concretely existing in the game that was totally free to be different. So it's really not that simple. It's the fundamental framework of the game. It's better to think of it like the gold standard, what Keynes called a barbarous relic. The dollar is no longer pegged to a fixed quantity of gold, but the U.S. government is still sitting on tons of gold in Fort Knox in the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. The archaic stuff is still encoded into the game in various ways. some of it isn't necessarily archaic, so you have to know which parts are the early installment weirdness to avoid misusing them. Otherwise, you'll end up reading them out of context. Let's do a little digression and aside about chemistry and gemstone, which has alchemy, magic chemistry. As an aside, there are no chemical explosives in Calthea without the use of magic. This dates back to earlier ice books from the 1980s, like the Cloud Lords of Tanara in 1984. The Master Atlas of 1992 explains that essence fluctuations have a transmuting effect on the chemical reactions involved. Then the very first bomb-like chemical explosives since the interregnum did not happen until just now in the Shadow World setting, though that was not established yet in Shadow World during the Ice Age of Gemstone. Simultronic split from ice licensing before that was established. The other given reason is that magic suppressed the motivation to develop such weapons, that there were other ways of being destructive more easily developed. Gunpowder is a lot less useful if someone doing magic one batch at a time is a bottleneck for making it. It's a hand wave, but at least originally that was the implicit reason gemstone had no gunpowder, even though we have sulfur and charcoal and saltpeter can be made from manure. That's Calthea. What about Elanthia? The status of purely chemical explosives in Elanthia is dubious. There are sulfur traps, but it's not obvious there's no magic involved in sulfur traps. Fireworks in our alchemy system only works if you infuse mana or include elemental fire magic while making it. Firework press items use charges from magic wands. These also have ingredients which, not including labor, cost roughly 1,000 silvers per firework, which does not sound cost-effective for soldiers firing bullets. Not that our silver economy makes any rigorous sense. The open sea adventure ship cannons were described by GM Retzer as partly magical. They fire without inserting powders or handling fuses. But I don't believe we've ever seen such cannons used in land battles. That's one of those almost separate sub-games of the game things. Though we've had ship pylons firing on towns. So we also have pylons, which have to be charged up with mana or else use some grade of plynite, like the hand pylons now sold at Duskrun. How available is plynite to NPCs? Even the weak stuff is made from powerful elementals. It's probably a very impractical weapon to scale up. Some lethal toy weapon of the very wealthy, which is so much the better for the integrity of the world setting, because we'd be doing Star Wars instead of Lord of the Rings. But digression aside. What about the planet of Calthea? As you can see, Calthea has a circumference of 27,000 miles compared to Earth's 24,901 miles. Calthea is slightly less dense than Earth, scarcity of heavy metals. Its gravity is probably about the same as Earth. So Calthea has a diameter of 8,600 miles compared to Earth's 7,918 miles. It has a 25-degree axial tilt. The back and forth variation produces 4 seasons. Earth's axial tilt, its obliquity, is currently 23.4 degrees, varying between 22 and 24.5 and 40,000 years of cycles. One of the Milankovitch cycles, which are what caused the ice ages. Larger tilt favors deglaciation, but Calthea still has ice caps at 25 degrees. Its magnetic field has an additional complicating factor interacting with the flows of essence. The magnetic poles move around unstably within 15 degrees. North-south lines deviate by as much as 20 degrees. That by itself isn't so bad. In the real world, the magnetic field has similar declinations from true geographic north, but in Shadow World the declinations are also warped by essence flows. Compasses are virtually useless in Shadow World. What it must mean is that maps of isogonic lines showing the declination gradient are not feasible, that the flows of essence make relatively rapid fluctuations in the field. So, there are 15 planets in the solar system if you include the asteroid belt, otherwise there are 14 planets. They orbit a G-type star. The sun of Earth's solar system is a G-type star. Elanthia's sun is manifestly not a red dwarf, almost certainly G-type. Its mass would have to be within plus or minus 15% of our sun's mass. The ratio of Elanthia's period and orbital distance will be determined by the Sun's mass and the universe's gravitational constant, Kepler's third law, Newtonian gravity. Since the period is 365 Earth days and we have Earth-like gravity and materials, Elanthia will be similarly far from its sun as the Earth. Though granted, we're assuming a lot of physics about how matter works, having stars work like they do in the real world. That's totally fair for Shadow World, less obviously fair for Elanthia. Can the gravitational constant be different? Well, yes and no. The fundamental physical constants are really dimensionless in the real world, meaning they are combinations of constants like big G, where the dimensions all cancel out and it's a pure number. These pure numbers scale the strengths of the different forces. So to change one component constant even a little, you have to change others by the same amount. Otherwise, you very quickly do not end up with a universe that resembles our own, stars not forming, and so forth. But that's too deep into the weeds. You should just go with big G, gravitational constant, being about the same as our world. And Elanthia's sun as a G-type star, not some burning ember. What about the planets now? In GemStone's Elanthia, the exact number of planets is undefined, at least in terms of player-facing documentation. In DragonRealms, there are 13 planets. Similar to our solar system, with Shadow World, there are rocky inner planets, then gas outer planets, and then a far-out rocky planet. It's not like that in the universe in general. Astronomers have now found a bunch of hot Jupiters very close to their stars. Pluto was still classified as a full planet in 1989, though Vul is much larger than Pluto. The Shadow World was defined before any real-life exoplanets had been confirmed. Those planets are named in Heretic, but most are undefined words. This chart from the Shadow World Master Atlas First Edition specifies orbital distances and periods for the planets. These are only approximately correct. The authors were probably pattern matching Earth's solar system. What do I mean by saying only approximately correct? I mean the numbers are somewhat off from what they should be by Kepler's third law, which is the relation between orbital radius and period. Now, before you object with some contrarian argument about what if it's different in that universe, Kepler's laws are not arbitrary. They are a straightforward consequence of very basic aspects of gravity and the physics of motion. People are way too glib in assuming that you can just have different physics, while still having a world that we would recognize as normal. I will elaborate on that later. So, Calthea has a 350-day solar year, but you have to be careful with this because those are Calthean days. There are 25 hours in a Calthean day, at least from the 1992 Master Atlas onward, which means Calthea's solar year is actually 365 Earth days. Calthea has 5 moons. Only one of these is large like the moon of Earth. The other 4 probably originated as captured asteroids. The largest moon is Orion, what we now call Liabo. It is called the Great Moon in Shadow World. This phrase still existed in the in-game text of GemStone, so it eventually slipped back into our own post-ICE documentation. That has happened repeatedly over the years, because the staff has to be aware something is archaic to not keep using it. It is in some scandalously rare exception. There are dozens of examples, including terms that didn't get de-iced, some of which ended up in later documentation with retconned meanings, which, not everything needed to be changed. Otherwise, the whole game at that time would have been totally rewritten. Leave Brittany alone, guys. It's not a problem. But Orion is significantly larger than Earth's moon. Its diameter is 3,500 miles compared to 2,159 miles. Its rotation on its axis is the same as its orbital period around Calthea, which implies Orion is tidally locked, like our moon. That is, the same side always faces us. Orion has a 70-day orbit around Calthea, nearly along the equator, and is 270,000 miles away, as opposed to Earth's moon, which is 239,000 miles and orbits every 27.3 days. So the orbital period of Orion is completely wrong. It would be closer to 33 days. The idea that it has a 70-day orbit splitting up the 350-day year into 5 lunar months was carried forward from older ice books before the full Shadow World setting was formulated. They inserted a slightly greater orbital distance than Earth's moon after the fact for the Shadow World Master Atlas, which created self-contradiction. The hand wave would have to be that there are serious alterations to its orbit due to the flows of essence and the lords of Orion. But anyway, the second largest moon, Varan, was the size of a very large asteroid, roughly 600 miles in diameter. To put that into context, that's the size of Ceres, the largest asteroid in Earth's solar system, only a little bit smaller than Pluto's largest moon, which happens to also be named Charon. Unless it is on some exotic orbit like a horseshoe orbit, Varan does not exist for Elanthia. Luxel thinks Varan is the meteor they had crashed down at the end of the Ice Age, when they caused the literal Ice Age, which of course is just a joke. If that's actually true, that the missing moon fell to the Earth, it'd be very tongue-in-cheek and totally OOC. I think the word Varan just wasn't being used in the game, so that moon just didn't get kept with a new name. So the third largest moon was Charon. Charon is the moon of the dark gods in Shadow World, at least as of 1990 onward. It is the size of a large asteroid as well, 350 miles in diameter. Charon was replaced with Lornon for Elanthia. Replaced, right? These are not just new names for the same thing. They are replacement concepts. That's subtle, but is important because you can't just use the archaic lore by changing the words. So, unlike the other moons, Charon isn't set on a polar orbit. It passes over the poles. Charon is closer to Calthea than Orhan. Neither of those is true of Lornon. Though Charon did manage to pass behind Orhan in a rare eclipse in the Marlies storyline in 1994, you can see a representation of this in Imera's shrine in the Lycerian Hills. Or really, I should say, Elora's shrine in the Sealfar Strait. Charon has a very highly elliptical orbit. Its orbital distance varies a lot. Tlaloc is the smallest moon, only 40 miles, and orbits the moon Orion. Macquarie is over twice as large as Tlaloc and orbits Calthea. These became Tiloac and Macquarie for Elanthia. At some point in GemStone III, after the Ice Age, somehow Macquarie got declared to be smaller than Tiloac, and they both orbit Liabo now, and supposedly it is Macquarie that was destroyed in DragonRealms, except Tiloac does not exist in DragonRealms either. I'm skeptical about all that. I'm inclined to think some things were just not kept consistent, multiple hands touching the same stuff years apart, where the premise in DragonRealms was that the smallest moon Grazier was the one that was destroyed. If I had to bet, I would bet the Macquarie-Tiloac situation was made up by players and then that got canonized later, because the current concept was being used in pre-canonized form on the Moonstone Abbey website. So I've actually gambled that Grazier was originally supposed to be Tiloac. Could be wrong, but that's my speculation. But the three moons in DragonRealms all go around Elanthia, apparently in retrograde orbits. And their orbital periods are all totally different than Gemstone's moons, which means their orbital distances are deeply inconsistent. Between the two games, I mean. If DragonRealms was in the future, Liabo would be closer if the lunar orbit is retrograde motion, because of the interaction of tidal forces. But Katamba is much further away than Liabo. Katamba is implicitly 294,000 miles away. Liabo would only be 96,000 miles away. Their Elanthia also has a 400-day year, where a day is still 24 hours. The days would slow down if Liabo got farther away from Elanthia, at least if it happened naturally, stealing the angular momentum. And the sun would burn out long before Elanthia's orbit widened that much. There are lots of anomalies along these lines. So, bottom line, Calthea's size, orbit, tilt, magnetic tilt, day, and seasons are almost the same as Earth. It is a spheroid that goes around a roughly sun-sized G-type star. Its tides are a bit over 12 hours, about the same as Earth. We should expect anything relevant from the Ice Age to reflect the world as being round. Here's that room again from 1991 that says the center of the world is down. Here's a globe with continents in the broken land from 1993. In the Shadow World setting, only the Western Hemisphere is known because of a barrier formed by the Eyes of Utha, called the Wall of Darkness. Globes of Calthea are by default blank on their eastern halves. This globe does not mention it one way or the other, but that is worth mentioning. since the moon Charon goes over the poles crossing the eastern hemisphere. I would even go so far as to suggest its creator was making a little nod to this issue by having the globe be rusted stuck. But that is cheating, using rooms from before 1996. What about Elanthia? Well, let's start with what NPCs think, the within-world setting representations. We can approach this from various angles. What are the objective empirical facts about the moon orbits as they exist in GemStone? Moonstone Abbey had previously worked up various exact specifications for the moons. Some of that was canonized. The orbital periods, for example. I'm working on how that all happened. Liabo is supposed to orbit Elanthia every 7.3 days. Lornon orbits Elanthia every 32.3 days. Tillac and Makiri orbit Liabo every 1.3 days, offset from each other by 60 degrees. I've heard that it looks like Liabo is really orbiting it, more like 7.45 days in practice with however it was coded, but I'm not a close observer. That was mechanically implemented into the game in 2002. Similarly, I haven't put in the time to figure out if the moon phases all make sense and so on. I suspect you can only pull these threads so much before they unravel. It's arguably bad form to read implications into the artifacts of GemStone's coding limitations. The lack of time zones, simultaneous sunsets at all locations, that kind of thing. It's analogous to clipping through a wall in graphical games. It doesn't really mean anything. But regardless, there were old OOC notes quoted by former GM Banthas on Discord in November 2019 that said, Liabo is closer, thus the speed difference. GM Rome also posted those orbital period numbers on the forums at some point in the past several years. Let's look at the Elanthian Moons document that was released in Hot Summer Nights 2002. This has a couple of OOC notes on it about the future moons, which is very rare for GemStone lore documents. They've started doing it more often. I'm ambivalent about that. The rest of the document is I.C.E. It is something your character could pick up off a shelf. Literally, this is an actual book in the Hall of Lore in Library Ace, however that is supposed to be pronounced. So right off the bat, Lornon appears to be quite a distance away compared to Liabo, and it takes a full month for it to achieve full orbit. This immediately tells us that Elanthian scholars relate orbital periods with distance from Elanthia. Kepler's third law actually speaks in terms of ratios of celestial bodies orbiting the same body. So here that would be Elanthia contrasting the Liabo and Lornon radii due to their periods. The uncertainty about Lornon's surface here belies the ambiguity over the Broken Lands. In the 2007 release of Spell 350 Miracle, it was presumed to be Lornon. The Broken Land is otherwise Ice Age and a complex subject. You can watch my Broken Land series, but it probably wasn't supposed to be the Moon of the Dark Gods. There's a much stronger case for it being a nightmarish parallel world, where everything is inverted and grotesque from this world. Shadow Valley does this too, but much more blatantly. Next is the stuff about Lornon turning blood red on Lornon's Eve with the magical disruptions and dark cult activities. This is vestigial from the ice lore for Charon, so parts of it do not quite make sense out of context. This happens once per solar year rather than something obvious with the lunar cycle. It refers to the peak of it as its bloody zenith. This could be hand-waved as the figurative sense of zenith as the time something is most powerful. Zenith in astronomical terms means the celestial body is directly overhead. Earth's moon only does this roughly between the tropics, places relatively near the equator. In the ice lore for Charon, the zenith happens much more widely because of the polar orbit. However, the night of the third moon, or dark side zenith, is not just the zenith. Charon must also be a full moon. With both these criteria, it has a reddish glow. This only happens for places at the lower latitudes, and at different times from each other, once every 149 days. Why does this mysterious, only on a full moon, reddish glow happen? This is interesting because the source books never actually say it, but it's not mysterious at all. It's implicitly because Charon is passing through Calthea's umbra, that is, it's a total lunar eclipse inside Calthea's shadow. Total lunar eclipses can only happen on the full moon because of the necessary alignment. Earth's moon turns red in the same situation. It happens because of light scattering by the atmosphere. The light hitting the eclipsed moon has to pass through our atmosphere first, which makes the blue light waves scatter off before reaching the moon, leaving the red colors, which are reflected back. It's just that Corona has a polar orbit. It's rarely on the ecliptic. So the lunar eclipses happen much less often than on Earth, because Corona can only be full near the equator. Then the huge blood red moon event is something else, a special case of this dark side zenith event, when Corona is also at its closest, when the full moon coincides with perigee every 10.2 years. This is related to the wobble, that is the precession of its orbit. There's no indication Lornon has a polar orbit. It isn't clear why the bloody hue happens once per solar year for Lornon. That's the Elanthian system's orbit around the Sun, not Lornon's orbit around Elanthia. Lornon's red colors also begin as swirls, growing gradually over about 11 days, 1/3 of its orbit. It seems more like an atmospheric effect or something unleashed on Lornon, but whatever is causing that is not obvious. So, in the Elanthian lore, the Arcadi supposedly used to reside on the moons from their exile by the Drakes. This was not part of the initial lore after the de-ice. It was first in documentation a few years later. There's no mention of it in the base History of Elanthia document. If you look at Arcadi pages on the Wayback Machine, like Lorana's or Eviala's websites, you will not see anything about it that far back, before roughly 1999. It was the expansion of the Gods of Elanthia document in late 1998 or early 1999 that first talks about the moon exiles. But the idea is that now, in the present day, the Arcadi no longer reside on the moons. In contrast, the major gods do reside on the moons in the ice lore. The dark gods are mostly imprisoned on Corona. They sometimes travel down to the world on these celestial events because the moon is physically closer. Cults worship the night of the third moon, as it is called, in the Shadow World setting. So that concept got carried forward. Next, we have Liabo is the largest of all the moons and also the lunar body which has the strongest influence on Elanthia's tides. Let's unpack the implications of this statement. First, before touching anything else, they are distinguishing the moons as the lunar bodies that influence the tides. This is implying two things. One, they do not consider the sun to be one of the moons. That is not inherently obvious. One of Liabo's nicknames is the second sun. Two, they implicitly recognize non-lunar influences on the tides, namely the sun. Second, they're saying they know the relative sizes of the moons, that Liabo is larger than Lornon. They have to know the relationship of orbital period and distance to make that assertion, unless it passes over Liabo as depicted in Mara's Shrine in the Marley Story event. But that doesn't count, it was made in the Ice Age. In the Red Forest release in 2016, for example, Liabo and Lornon aligned with each other without one eclipsing the other. There are two ways to appear smaller in the sky after all, either by being smaller or by being farther away. Lornon could be larger than Liabo, in other words, if it were far enough away. So they must be able to determine its distance from Elanthia. Otherwise, they could believe it is smaller than Liabo and closer, and that it just goes around the sky more slowly. Similarly, they could believe Liabo is that much larger and farther away and moving that much faster. But they instead believe Lornon is both smaller and more distant, which requires a constraint. That it isn't possible to be both closer and orbiting more slowly, which is the essence of Kepler's laws. So the orbital periods are a simple observation of the moon cycles. That's only half of it. How would the NPCs of Elanthia be able to know how far away the moons are from the world? Ancient people on Earth did know how to calculate the distance of the moon. One way is parallax. You measure the position of the moon in the sky at the same time against the background constellations from locations of known distance of separation. This forms a line-of-sight triangle of known angles, and then it's just geometry to calculate the distance of the moon. Elanthians would easily be able to do this for Liabo and Lornon. They would also be able to measure the radius of Elanthia this way if it is roughly spherical. Another way would be with lunar eclipses, Elanthia's shadow cast on the moons. They would be able to extrapolate an empirical rule of thumb using the shadow cast by a ball with a light source behind it. Since the ancient Greeks were able to calculate the Earth's radius, they were able to calculate the moon's distance. Then the same is true in reverse, distance from parallax, finding the radius of the Earth. In the case of the shadow of the Earth, it was done by Aristarchus of Samos. He was able to find the moon diameter was around a third of Earth's. So, thousands of years ago, they had calculated Earth's moon was about 250,000 miles away. Early astronomers such as Hipparchus of Greece and Ptolemy of Alexandria. Eratosthenes even earlier had calculated the circumference of the Earth using the different lengths of shadows from poles at the same time in different locations. This isn't the kind of thing our characters can do mechanically because it would have to be coded into GemStone, but in principle this is well within the ability and knowledge base of Elanthian NPCs. They would also be able to see the rounded silhouette of Elanthia's shadow during lunar eclipses, which would keep happening every time, which would require Elanthia to be roughly spherical. But that's more of an in-principle thing than something that happens in the game. Next, we notice that Liabo is said to have the strongest influence on Elanthia's tides. This is striking. Such an interpretation could follow from correlating the moon phases with the tides without reference to gravity. But further down, Mercury is too small to have any effect on the tides, which is something else. Tiliac has a small effect, Mercury an imperceptible effect. They are on the same orbital cycle, mostly appearing together. They know Tiliac and Mercury disappear behind Liabo, so they know they are about as far away as Liabo. It is their sizes that makes the difference, in spite of their closeness. This leaves us with the conclusion that Elanthian astronomers believe it is the sizes of the moons that matters for strength on the tides. This means they understand that Liabo's greater pull combined with Elanthia's rotation is what causes the tides, and that Liabo is larger and closer than Lornon, so it has the dominant effect, but that Lornon has a stronger pull than Tiliac, in spite of being much farther away. They understand Lornon would appear larger in the sky if it was closer to Elanthia, which means they are not conflating Liabo's apparent and absolute sizes. It is their understanding of moon distances that allows it. So their certainty that the moons cause a tide stands way out, because that has not been the only interpretation historically. There were ideas that the Earth was breathing, for example, or that water was coming in and out of the deep Earth. There was even the idea that moonlight was causing heat expansion of the water. They could argue, for example, Liabo is just brighter than Lornon, and Lornon is brighter than Tiliac is brighter than Mercury, and that's brightness rather than size that matters. The sun would then be the biggest cause of tides. Galileo also tried to argue the tides were really caused by Earth orbiting the sun. That is, Galileo rejected the lunar theory, and he was wrong. The sun is a lot bigger, but much further away, so the lunar effect is about twice as strong. Kepler had believed the tides were caused by the moon's gravity, similar to the observable phenomenon of magnetic forces. Then it was Isaac Newton's gravitational theory that related mass and gravitational forces, and Kepler's laws fall almost effortlessly out of Newton's theory, which explained why heliocentrism happens. So it is remarkable that the Elanthian astronomers are so certain that it is moon size that matters, with awareness that distance also matters. They do not believe the other planets, or the sun, for example, are the primary causes of the Elanthian tides. They seem to have at least a Keplerian understanding of celestial mechanics. When the Elemental Confluence was released, the bad guy NPC, an Elatoy named Eleusius, said he knew it was coming and when it would arrive to Elanthia, because it had grazed by Bernier decades earlier, and he had calculated its trajectory, which means they have at least some capacity for calculating trajectories. In his own words, theories are not merely guesswork. What I present to you is years of work backed by the most rigorous equations available. It would also, at least probably, make no sense if Bernier was not another planet in the same universe as Elanthia. Former GM Banthus has said he intended the Elatoy world to be in the same universe as Elanthia. That is, it is not some other plane of existence, it's just another planet. But this has been treated inconsistently. Some people have assumed it is in another dimension, and the history of the Fernier document from 2007, for example, refers to the other planar enslavement of the Elatoy. That shouldn't have gotten through Key City, but what can you do? I do not know whether Bernier is supposed to be in the same solar system as Elanthia. It should not be light years away given the confluence's week-long approach. It would have to be very close to being in another star system, or else the confluence would have been moving much too fast compared to that storyline event. Lucius would also need to know where it is to do that math. There's no way Atlantean astronomers see exoplanets. Earth astronomers did not pull that off until the 1990s. I'm not in the habit of pointing out documentation inconsistencies unless it's being asked because they're usually harmless as long as people do not notice them. But something else that is amusing is that you can look at Liabo through a telescope in the Cyclones observatory outside Talastim. Liabo has continents, mountains, forests, seas, and rivers when you look at it from this observatory, which contradicts the Atlantean Moons document. This is because the observatory was initially built in roughly 1994, around the same time as the shrines to the light gods around the landing. Former GM Banthus intended it originally as part of a shrine to Valrus, who we now call Luminous. So the way Liabo looks in it is consistent with the archaic lore for Orhan. I've heard it actually said Orhan, it had to be typo reported. The observatory was included much later with the Elven Nations released in 2001, which was a year before the Atlantean Moons document was released. So the Moons document contradicted something that already existed in the game, which was much older, which could have been put anywhere because it makes no reference to the Elstim. Now we can go to Liabo and the Rings of Luminous Pay event, which portrays Liabo in a way that is consistent with the Moons document. I hope this observatory is never fixed. I hate it when staff fixes things by overwriting old text. It makes it harder to keep things straight, wiping out concepts and introducing anachronisms. I think of it like fixing the Mona Lisa's crooked smile or painting over her with something more modern. It's also like Orwellian, memory holing things. We've already seen it this way for 20 years. We don't want the game to be like, we've always been at war with Brigandia. Is this something that needs to be fixed? No, just call it a magic telescope and leave it alone. Leave Brittany alone. So, back on the subject of the solar system and determining trajectories. One might wonder if the Atlantean astronomers have a heliocentric or geocentric view of the skies. That is, do they think it all revolves around Atlantia or around the sun? Both views for our own solar system date back to the ancient Greeks. It was not really settled until Isaac Newton's Principia and 18th century measures of stellar aberration, which is due to the motion of the stars. That's around the time the Catholic Church started backing off. So, how biased are Atlanteans on it? Well, right off the bat, we know it is not completely geocentric. They know that Tiloak and Mercury disappear on one side of Liabo, reappear on the other side every day. Galileo caused some consternation, for example, just for observing moons going around Jupiter. There is no doubt in Atlantia that Liabo has its own moons. The moons in the sky have phases, and the lunar phases are represented in various rooms. You can see it here, for example, it's caused by relative positions. But that does not help us much. The geocentric model is able to explain the moon phases. You need more than just the moon. By the way, moon phases are not caused by the Earth's shadow. That situation of a shadow on the moon is called a lunar eclipse. Lunar phases are only about the relative positions of the moon's sun and world. With more than one moon, they might be able to reject geocentrism using just the moon phases. Inconsistencies with how the moons are simultaneously lit up, assuming the sun is revolving around Atlantia. I would have to think about that. They could maybe come up with ad hoc epicycles or whatever to explain away discrepancies. In the modern understanding of physics, the choice of reference frame is arbitrary. That is, physical laws are defined independent of coordinate systems, so it doesn't matter if you choose to center on Earth or Sun. But the planets will still be rotating around the Sun compared to the fixed background of stars. And of course, we now know the Sun is going around the Milky Way galaxy, and the galaxy is moving against the cosmic background radiation. So heliocentrism is itself a provincial model. What about NPC depictions of moons? If you look around in GemStone, there are various spots with moon depictions where they are represented as globes or spheres. You can also see it here, for example, and celestial bodies are represented as globes in Aramir's room. The Wolf's Den is from over 20,000 years ago. Aramir was educated by the Elistim. So it is a common enough belief that moons are spheres. What about planets? For one thing, there's a brass orrery in one of the Wizard Guild buildings, which depicts other planets as globes. While we do not have planet lore defined in GemStone, the NPCs apparently know more about it than we do. But if they can see the planets through telescopes, they can also see the phases of the planets. That is how Galileo rejected Ptolemy's geocentrism. Not that geocentrism should have ever been deeply rooted in Elanthia, as Tillamook can be seen orbiting Liabo with the naked eye. You might even wonder if at some point in the deep past it was believed everything revolved around Liabo, given the religious reasons for associating the gods with Liabo. But that's never been stated. I'm just floating the plausibility of that religious belief. For all we know, Luminous told the elves what's what way back in the day. Maybe Fasholne lured them into devising astronomical methods, which were then used for navigating warships, or whatever. Likewise, we can look at the crystal orb on the throne in the Drake Shrine, which was put there by the Arcadi. Inside it represents planets with moons going around them, but the sun is at the center of it all. So the celestial heavens in GemStone are heliocentric, and that seems understood. The other planets also seem to be understood as being round. There's also a mural of glowing moss in the mines of Shadow Valley, illustrating a dragon surrounded by spheroids. It is described as breathing fire upon a small planet just underneath it. This part of Shadow Valley was released after the Ice Age, so technically it counts. What about constellations? When the world is spherical, your latitude determines which stars you can see, changing their angles with the horizon. You would see some different stars near the horizon at the northern and southern ends of Elanthia. The northern and southern hemispheres would have different constellations. What is the title of the Constellations lore document? Constellations of the Northern Sky. That can be regarded as an I.C.E. understanding. Recall earlier I pointed out the original partial continent map after the Ice Age refers to the northwestern hemisphere. That is, GemStone is set in the northern hemisphere, suggesting there is also a southern hemisphere. Maybe you can try to argue the hemisphere refers to the dome covering the flat world. There is some changing of constellation configurations with the seasons. These dates are astrological rather than astronomical. The extent to which astrology and astronomy are distinct in Elanthia is not clear, because the moons have real discernible effects on magic and mana foci, as mentioned in the Elanthian Moons document. And Melgren's Reach, obviously, but that is Ice Age, so referring to that is cheating. In DragonRealms, of course, moon mages are a profession, with lunar mana. There are major differences with how magic works in DragonRealms. There are no statements regarding stellar parallax as far as I can tell, whether they think the stars are much farther away. The slight variations in position of stars depending on Elanthia's position around the sun. It was not successfully measured with telescopes until the 19th century. Elanthian astronomers have to think the stars are very far away from Elanthia if they also believe heliocentrism. Otherwise, they would be able to see the stars shifting throughout the year. The absence of mentioning it suggests it does not happen, or at least it would in principle. It's not like you can assume authorial intent with that kind of implication by omission is way too subtle. It's scrubbing the documentation too hard, over-analysis. But it does bear mentioning a related point. The night sky in GemStone is not represented as having many more stars to the naked eye than Earth. It is dark out at night. It is not almost as bright as the day. So we might reasonably infer the Elanthian solar system is in a lower density part of its galaxy, much as Earth's solar system. Because if it was in a dense region with closer and fast-moving stars, like in the galactic bulge of the Milky Way, the sky would be represented very differently. We wouldn't be talking about constellations. There would be way too many bright stars in the sky for constellations to be meaningful, which in a sense is a justification for using the fixed background stars concept. Elves would live long enough to notice stars moving in Milky Way's center region within their own lifespan. This is all very abstract and fancy schmancy. Some people will only believe it if they can actually go there and see it. So that raises the question of circumnavigation. Does the lore describe going around the world? The post-ice gods document for Charl has always said there are 6 oceans. Religion lore is unreliable narration in general, but that does imply a belief in 6 oceans. But there may well be only one ocean. How you divide up the ocean into multiple oceans is a convention. So it is not obvious from this that it is actually speaking for the whole world. The shrimp sailed all over, one would think. The Epistemology Society document says the lore masters have visited every continent, so they should know if the world is edged. Unlike Shadow World, which has a barrier called the Wall of Darkness, nothing indicates we are limited to the Western Hemisphere. How you would decide which hemisphere is west and which is east, I do not know, but that is the convention in Shadow World. Though Ossian's Krovan documentation does suggest the utter west is not sailed to by us in the present age of Elanthia. In the Elanthia context, that is ethnocentric. It means west of Chantara or west of Elanith and Imranith. Some information is established about the other continents of Elanthia, though the world map is still only vaguely defined. There's a continent to the south, or possibly the southeast, that is named Phinia, and which was originally replacing the ice continent of Emer in the Shadow Valley story. Here's an OOC post from Rome stating travel to Phinia has largely been dangerous due to the barriers from raw essence storms that plague the seas across Elanthia, which is an interesting world-setting detail because you would not know that from the game itself. Even OSA does not go that far out. This premise could be used to explain in a retcon sort of way why Atlantis history has so little to do with other continents. I was going to wait until more was released about Phinia before making a video on this subject, but it's been several years now and I'm not sure how much longer it might be. So, YOLO. Atlantis is the main central mass of the continent Jantara, which is a retcon that includes surrounding island and land masses. In the Ice Age, the continent was Jaimon, which was de-iced as Jantara. Elanith replaced the word Kelborn, which was only the northwest corner of Jaimon. And so Elanith should only have been the northwest corner of Jantara, but Elanith came to be the word used for the whole continent. Continuity drift, these things happen. So much later, the word Jantara got retconned. It is something like the Australasia to Atlantis, Australia. There are surrounding continents that are part of Jantara, such as Etanarith and Rune Creek, which are on the northeast and northwest sides of Atlantis. You probably shouldn't take the positions of these islands too literally. We do not know that these maps are properly scaled. Consider that Glauben was just retconned, really more like retconned again, to move it farther from the landing. In the Ice Age, the Kroll Island was further east inside the bay than the landing was. It was closer to that village with the Krovan warfarers in what is now called the Lycerian Hills than the landing was. But then it got moved further west after the de-ice, and now it's even further away from the bay. So, to the west is a bunch of Krovan-infested islands called the Shattered Continent. There is at least one continent south of Atlantis called Phinia. The half-Krovan colonies document describes sailing around southern Atlantis to Etanarith. Then it seems to describe sailing to the southern continent and then sailing east to the Shattered Continent. GM scribes confirmed on the forums at the time that this is implying the world is round, since the Shattered Continent is west of western Atlantis. That isn't really consistent with what Ossian has done later with the Krovan documentation, with what he calls the Utter West. You could perversely argue Scribes' document is ambiguously worded, merely saying, this is our history of sailing east, that the Krovan originated further west in the unknown waters and sailed east to the Shattered Continent. But the paragraph would have to be really badly structured for that to be right. It sounds like it's implying what you see traveling east from Atlantis. Take from that what you will. Choose wisely. The Shattered Continent is described as the northern seas, and to the south of it is a continent made up of 3 large islands. The race of humans once on that continent are implicitly the Reavers, cross-referencing with GM Scribe's other documents. The islands are due west of Maelstrom Bay, which is where the Reaver ancestors sailed west from, whereas the Shattered Continent, once called Imranith, is west of Glauben, which is now as far north as Ice Mule and Barman Cove. And no, the Reaver Kingdom was not on the same continent as the Krovan. They were not part of the Shattered Continent. Their kingdom was described as being on a separate continent to the south before Imranith shattered. Scribe's document also describes that the far south and far north are both frozen, the so-called frozen lands at the bottom of the world. That is, Elanthia has ice caps if it is round. So there's no indication the world has edges, and some indication it has been circumnavigated. Flat earthers think the ice cap is a wall that reaches all the way around. But here there's no indication east and west become frozen. As a brief aside, if you look at the current map of Atlantis, the Eastern Ocean is called the Abandoned Waters. This is somewhat vestigial. It's an obscure term that got carried forward. The town guard NPC, Quintellerin, Sleepy, says Jantara is between the Forgotten Sea and the Abandoned Waters. These are the de-ice terms for Jaimon, Forbidden Sea, and Barren Waters. But the dominant name for the Western Ocean is now the Great Western Sea, or the Great Western Seas, if you listen to the Kraken's Fall Link Captain, which is made up of multiple seas, where the Cobalt Sea is around Darkstone Bay, the Sea of Lazuli is around Salhaven, and so on. The sea around Maelstrom Bay by River's Rest is called the Kestrel Bay, but west of where Kesman Isle once was is called the Sunset Sea. That's a relatively obscure, buried detail like Forgotten Sea, which would have to be west of the whole of Jantara, supposedly including the Shattered Continent. But digression aside, what about representations of Elanthia? Well, you can see here an image of Imera cradling Elanthia, though it does not seem to give the shape of it. But here you can see Elanthia is represented as a globe, and it is a globe here as well. So we have representations of moons and planets as spheres in Gemstone, and we also have representations of Elanthia as spherical. We can safely infer from all of this that the concept of a spherical Elanthia exists within Gemstone's game setting. What about empirical evidence for Elanthia being round? We're limited in what we can do mechanically. It is not possible for us to construct a Foucault pendulum, for example, or measure the lengths of shadows from separated obelisks. So first we can consider stuff involving the horizon and elevation. There are rooms in the game that speak of what you can make out on the horizon from your elevation. From high up by Kisagir, for example, you can just barely make out Tavalor, which, by the way, the current staff pronounces it like Kisagir. The former staff that created it pronounces it Sizagir. Choose wisely. So the room painting up that way implies the changing elevation levels by changing the wording it uses along the path toward Talos-Stim. It shifts between words such as subalpine, alpine, and montane, which correspond to climates at distinct elevation levels. As it has to do with the tree lines, but with characteristic elevations at given latitudes. So you can just barely make out Tavalor when you're next to Sizagir, which can be reasonably taken to be as much as a mile or two up. To put this into perspective, when you stand on a 1 mile tall mountain peak on Earth, you can just barely see a city almost 100 miles away. It is not linearly proportional. 2 miles does not double it to 200 miles. It's more like 125 miles. From outside Icemeal, you can make out Wendimer's Landing way down in the far distance. If Elanthia was flat, this would not be what happens. You would be able to see all the way out. The further cities would just be smaller. You'd be able to see Tamsir and Sharath from Icemeal with a telescope. The floating city of Ion and Phidia from the floating castle of Reem. We also routinely see ships appear in storyline events. They rise up from the horizon because of the world's curvature, but they are not a constantly increasing speck. Otherwise, you'd be able to see ships as far away as your telescope can magnify, though you'd be hard-pressed to distinguish these from game messaging. The whole notion of being able to see further from higher elevations because the world is curved. Something more remarkable is that we have seen Elanthia from extreme heights. In the Web Anniversary event in 2017, there was a wildly unrealistic, huge spider web over Elanthia holding in place a big meteor. You could climb up there, and the only detail you could make out below was Mount Enatumgana's peak. And the meteor eventually crashed there and is a room object on Enatumgana now. But this field of view has Enatumgana essentially under the meteor. If there were a northern world edge, you would see it. and you would be able to see the southern continent here if the world was flat. You would also see the horizon's curvature from that height, but the rune painting doesn't say. That's generally the problem with this subject. The contrarian can say, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Then in the Rings of Luminous event, we go even higher up, though similarly the horizon curvature is unmentioned. We're able to look at Elanthia from the surface of Liabo itself. This is kind of ridiculous. It really should not be possible to launch yourself to the moon in the world setting. But pay event stuff is kind of low on Gemstone's seriousness to silliness spectrum. So you just have to kind of look the other way on it for immersions. Sometimes playing a game trumps realism in Gemstone, much to the chagrin of Puritans of realism. There's one of those unwinnable metagame debates. All the examples of unrealistic stuff some people might use to reject the validity of imposing realism as a game world constraint are in turn just more examples of things the other people say should not have happened. So we'll just snark that if the needle of Pentas shot you up at 200 miles per hour, it would take 20 days of travel for you to make it to Liabo. But still, you can observe Elanthia from Liabo. In fact, Tiloak passes over the Valles Elementum on Liabo. Tiloak is visibly a sphere in the sky. But the Isle of Ornath is tropical and south of Elanth, though its precise position has not been revealed yet. Here you can see Elanthia above the northern horizon of the quest area on Liabo. And what you see from that angle is the southern continent. Liabo is presumably tidally locked. That is, this side is always facing Elanthia because the rune painting is static. This is somewhat dubious given that Liabo orbits Elanthia every 7 days. Likewise, Elanthia should have complementary phases to Liabo. Gibbous Liabo, Crescent Elanthia, and so on. Actually, I don't have logs of trying to do this from the Links of Luminous quest area. I'm not sure offhand how that works, if Look Liabo is turned off and if Look Elanthia is turned on with inverted phases. I feel like I tested this, but I do not remember. But the idea seems to be that the Rings of Luminous quest area is geometrically aligned with the needle of Pentas, since you are shot seemingly straight up and down from these locations. Though Elanthia is spinning, of course, relative to Liabo, Liabo isn't in geosynchronous orbit. However you cut it, it must arc you on intercept courses, but it seems to be south side to south side. With Liabo orbiting on roughly the ecliptic, it suggests the Rings of Luminous quest area is on Liabo's southern hemisphere, and that the needle of Pentas is on that southern continent and sending you up to Liabo's southern hemisphere. Since you're only seeing the southern continent, that means Elanthia has to be round. It's like being positioned to see Africa and South America from the moon, especially when the North Pole is tilted away from the sun. You can't see the northern continents in that situation. With a flat Elanthia, you'd be able to see all of the continents from this far away. There would be no reason to single out the southern continent, unless it just means that part happens to not be blocked by the clouds. Again, static rune painting issues. Actually, Rings of Luminous is held after the spring equinox, but before the summer solstice. So the North Pole of Elanthia should be tilted toward the sun. But this is one of those situations where if you scrub it hard enough, you're going to find stuff that doesn't add up right. Now, Elanthia has 4 seasons is naturally explained by the oscillating axial tilt. Something more subtle is that Elanthia also has ice ages. If you look at the Unfinished Smuggler's History of River's Rest, for example, the sea level was lower than it is now tens of thousands of years ago, colder than now. Barlin Kane of Moosehead has also spoken of a historical past when the land that far north was not frozen, so a warmer period compared to now, though one might speculate that could have been regional factors like shifts in warmth due to the ocean currents rather than the whole world. But Bone Island off the southern waste seems to be a raised coral atoll with limestone at elevation above sea level. This suggests the sea level was significantly higher than it is now in the very distant past, though that one may be pushing it, the internal world logic consistency, because that probably wasn't intended to imply climate change. In the past, I thought the shattered continent and the broken continent south of it might not be so split up during the ice ages, when the sea level is lower and there's more glaciation. Maybe they're not divided into islands. But Oshant has since treated that differently. He has the shattered continent breaking up in a volcanic pyroclasm about 250 years ago. Regardless, we have a sea level going up and down, frozenness advancing and retreating. Elanthia must be in an interglacial period like Earth. The ice ages are largely driven by the Milankovitch cycles, which are variations in tilt in Earth's orbit around the Sun. The precession and the eccentricity and all that is not actually defined for Elanthia, but we have some indication for the existence of ice ages. During hothouse Earth periods of Earth's history, there are no polar ice caps at all. The sea level is hundreds of feet higher when that happens. Climate is more of a complex subject than the astronomy stuff, which is a lot harder to wriggle out of with what if it doesn't work that way appeals. But it's worth noting that the climate zones are described in the Elanthia Flora Guide documentation from 2002, which in turn refers to the equatorial region of Elanthia, ranging down to tropical as you move south. Equatorial has no meaning with a flat world. It refers to a great circle on a sphere. So there are implicitly latitudes going on here, and that word, as I showed, is explicitly used in DragonRealms. There are also a number of astrolabes within GemStone. There's a very ancient one made out of the roof of the Stone Eye building in River's Rest. That is, it is mentioned in documentation, the unfinished smuggler's history of River's Rest. It has writing on it that is slightly mangled Old English, pronounced something like Shuin de Saron and Noa Yorsix and Seas, which translates roughly as showing stars and it knows the oceans and seas. It might even be based off the word Sestiora, which would make it show the guiding star and it knows the oceans and the seas. Scribes intended this to be very elder Canaan, kind of the distant ancestor language to what humans speak today, which is effectively English. He had another example of the dialect of Canaan spoken in the citadel by River's Rest about 1,000 years ago, which were also words in Old English. This isn't being kept all that consistent. More recently, Canaan words have been introduced based on Welsh, which is a different language family from Old English, which is West Germanic, not Celtic. Later, Canaan is implicitly going to be a collision of multiple languages anyway. But the deeper into the weeds you go, the harder it is to be consistent. But regardless, this roof in River's Rest is an ancient astrolabe. Astrolabes work by having different plates for different latitudes. They are made assuming spherical worlds. The plates involve stereographic projections of the celestial sphere at given latitudes. I do not really want to get into all that. Astrolabes are pretty complicated. Nautical navigation involves using the North Star or the southern stars around the analogous point. There are sextants and star charts in various parts of the game as well. These devices would make no sense if Elanthia was flat, because the angle of the stars with the horizon would not change, much as you cannot measure longitude with a sextant. There's also an armillary sphere in House Brigada, but that has more to do with the sky being spherical. Now let's back up and consider physics instead of astronomy. People like to glibly assume physics can be different, but the problem with that is, with even very minor changes to the laws of physics, you would have profoundly different world outcomes. Small changes to just the physical constants would kill us, much less changes to how the fundamental forces work. The world as we know it exists because it is what is consistent with our laws of physics. Physics is utterly unforgiving because every logical consequence has to hold. When laws of physics get overturned, they do not become not true. They become special cases of more fundamental laws. Newtonian physics is the reality of everyday life. And physics is not metaphysics. It's not like you can open a hatch in space and see an equation with cosmic fire flowing through it. It is the rigorous and unyielding self-consistency of logic from an absolute minimum of fundamental assumptions. What about a dream world that only seems to resemble a natural world, like the eternal dream, where things have the illusory appearance of being natural but are actually arbitrary? Fine, but that is not what we have with Elanthia's material universe. Magic in Elanthia is physics briefly modified by foreign physics. That's how it is in both Shadow World and DragonRealms, and so it ought to be for Elanthia and GemStone. So just indulge me for a few minutes. I'm going on a detour into the weeds. I'm making a point about how we know things. But this part of it is going to be pretty dense, so I'll put up a skip ahead time in the video if you want to skip the weed whacking, because a lot of this will not be easy to follow. So if you want to do that, jump to 8.5 minutes from now. Okay. What is a law of physics? It is more nuanced than that expression taken by itself would suggest. There are different categories of physical laws. Some laws of physics are really causal definitions for generating the time evolution of physical states, the fundamental dynamical rules of a theory. These are generally expressions in the form of differential equations, which are the constraints on allowed behavior. They tell you what will happen under given conditions and what will not happen or even never happen. Newton's second law, the Schrödinger equation, Maxwell's laws of electromagnetism, Einstein's field equations. These provide the theory for explaining and predicting empirical regularities, which is to say the things that always happen under given conditions. There is no just a theory or in theory with them. They are universal. They apply constantly, always, within the limits of their applicability. They also cannot be directly falsified, because when you do an actual calculation, you're using some idealized model that can be disputed with complications. Causal rules are not themselves empirically observable. That goes back to at least the philosopher David Hume. They predict the patterns of behavior, if what you feed into them was right. In that sense, they are like the algorithms of a computer program, garbage in, garbage out. Think of how you can keep having more potential corrections, things left unaccounted for. Like, what about perturbations caused by other planets? But the Earth is not perfectly spherical, but the Earth slightly wobbles this way and that way, but the orbits are slightly eccentric. So you can invent ways to deflect the blame for inaccuracies from the dynamical law itself to the auxiliary hypotheses. Suppose light is being dragged from what it should be doing because of a luminiferous ether in space, and that just happens to be enough to offset the measurement discrepancies. But you're just assuming light exists in such a medium. Maybe it's real, and you've inferred it from its effects. Or maybe it's not, and something is broken. The more anomalies the theory has, and the less able it is to explain them without such ad hoc assumptions, the more attractive its rival theories become. This is part of why it takes a while to overturn established theories. Experiments are not silver bullets, because people try to find ways of explaining or dismissing the inconsistencies, or the rival theories have their own issues. The orbit of Uranus was wrong because it turned out Neptune existed. There was a missing source of gravity. The orbit of Mercury was wrong because it turned out Newton's laws of motion and gravity are wrong. They are only a special case of Einstein's gravity theory, general relativity. The differences between them are very small when you do not have extreme conditions happening. Mercury is just close enough to the Sun that their differences do matter. It also matters for the global positioning system, which requires so much precision from so far away. With just Newton's laws, the GPS system won't work. You need the relativistic corrections. There's pragmatism involved. What works ends up superseding what does not work. What about laws that are just rules for the empirical regularities? The Rydberg formula is the law that predicts the line spectra of light emitted by hydrogen-like atoms, but is just an equation without explanation. The Bohr model of the hydrogen atom and the Schrödinger equation actually predict the Rydberg formula mathematically. Schrödinger's equation also explains the multi-electron atoms where the Rydberg formula does not work. But that does not mean the Schrödinger equation is complete. It is fundamentally incapable of describing the interaction of matter and antimatter, which, as it turns out, is because it is not a relativistic theory. You also need relativity to describe heavy metal atoms, because the electrons are moving so fast. So you have a law-like model of empirical regularity, and you have theories of causal rules that generate it. Those phenomenological laws will exist regardless of whether you have a theory for them. Kepler's laws predict the elliptical planetary orbits. Those are basically rules of empirical regularity. but they do not explain how it happens. Kepler himself tried to explain his harmonies with nested ideal Platonic solids. He actually did that before his three laws historically, but that sounds more like metaphysics than physics. Newton's laws of motion combined with Newton's universal law of gravity allow you to derive Kepler's laws from first principles as a special case with near circular motion. The laws of motion are the fundamental rules of dynamics. The law of gravity is the specific form of force behavior for the gravitational force field. There is also more fundamental stuff in physics than these individual theories. There are more fundamental principles, like the principle of least action, where these kinds of laws can be derived from assumptions. That is, they can be calculated as mathematical results rather than independently postulated. That is probably the most fundamental law of physics. Quantum field theories, string theories, general relativity, everything works off least action principles. You provide the constraining assumptions, and the calculus of variations generates the differential equations. Quantum theory is more of a mathematical framework for converting classical theories, which is to say it is also more fundamental than any given theory. There are quantum theories, and there are wrong theories. Other laws like Ohm's law, voltage equals current times resistance, or Hooke's spring constant law, are not fundamental. They are constitutive relationships of matter. Kirchhoff's circuit laws are really just rules that work in idealized situations, where you're abstracting over the actual laws of electromagnetism. They do not work for high-frequency circuits, which becomes relevant, for example, in designing computer processors. Consider what that implies. You have laws that work under certain conditions, even though they're sweeping what's really going on under the rug. We're able to invent these artificial laws because the world is such that the same things always happen under the same conditions. The world is not arbitrary. It is a world of cause and effect. What about laws that emerge from large numbers of stuff rather than any given set of dynamical rules? The second law of thermodynamics, entropy, is a statistical law, emergent property. God help you if the laws of thermodynamics say you were wrong. Those dynamical laws like Newton's can get overthrown by more fundamental laws. Thermodynamics is never going to be overthrown within its basic framework of applicability. Conservation laws such as energy momentum are actually mathematically implicit properties of theories that are not independently postulated. In fact, with much of physics, you're really just doing calculus having assumed something about geometry. With Newton, it is Euclidean geometry. With Einstein, it is a kind of non-Euclidean geometry. Einstein once wrote, "What really interests me is whether God could have created the world any differently. In other words, whether the requirement of logical simplicity admits a margin of freedom. Because it really isn't clear that a world like ours can be consistent with significantly different laws of physics." I'm not going to keep beating this drum. I'm just saying logical consistency is an Iron Maiden. There's a whole lot that is implied, buried within very basic properties. So maybe the other planes, which are inherently magical, can work more metaphysically. Elanthia shouldn't under normal, non-magical conditions. Because when magic isn't happening, it's acting just like our world. Alright, end of manifesto. Back to Elanthia being round. What about Elanthia with its manifestly Euclidean space and familiar phenomena under non-relativistic conditions? Which, we have time warping stuff in GemStone, but let's not get into relativity. So we have the basics of motion, obviously. There's momentum, acceleration, friction, inertia, the exertion of forces, even thermodynamics like temperature and pressures. There is no preferential direction in space. All directions behave the same way, continuous, with measurable distances and parallel lines. That by itself implies an awful lot. Force is actually a superfluous concept for classical physics, at least if you have conservation of energy. If you know the positions of momenta, that is all you need. The trajectories follow the path of least action or similar notions. In a sense, the classical mechanics of motion are an implicit consequence of the structure of space and time. Even the conservation laws of energy and momentum are symmetries in space itself, or at least the laws under those spatial relations. If the laws of physics behave the same way regardless of where you are or which direction you're looking, you are going to have conservation momentum. If the laws of physics do not change over time or can be defined in a way that is time invariant, that is conservation of energy. All that is to say that a lot of stuff in physics is implicit in the properties of space itself. That's a deep mathematical result called Noether's theorem. So, with the force laws such as Newton's law of gravity and Coulomb's law for the electric field, the equations look almost identical. This is not coincidental. It is an implicit consequence of existing in three-dimensional space. The difference is there are no opposite gravitational charges, so gravity is not screened, and so it dominates at large scales. And the gravitational constant is much weaker, so the electric force is much stronger. Otherwise, it is the same logic of two objects interacting. Newton's law of gravity says the strength of attraction between two bodies is proportional to their masses. The gravitational constant and the inverse square law come from space itself, which is what scales the strength of the gravitational forces. Imagine there are invisible spheres around the Earth, and Earth has a certain amount of gravity. But that would mean its gravity is thinning out at greater distances. Imagine it diluting on the surfaces of increasingly larger spheres. That is, the same amount of gravity is more spread out because it is spread across a larger surface area. The surface area of a three-dimensional sphere is 4 pi r squared, where r is radius. So radius squared. This is essentially the reason for the inverse square law decay for the strength of long-range forces. You can also write equations for how gravity works in higher dimensions, but the expression is more complicated even if space is flat. It's called Gauss's law with arbitrary dimensions. So what Newton's law of gravity says is very basic, the proportional attraction of masses, and there are manifestly three spatial dimensions in the Elanthia universe. Orbits are actually unstable in more than 3 dimensions, unless the extra dimensions are compacted, made very small. You also can't tie knots in more than 3 dimensions. This is stuff that can be proved with math. But we know from the Elanthia Moons document that it is the size of the moon that determines its pull on the tides. Tidal forces are a body pulling stronger on the closer side of another body, because the strength of gravity gets weaker with greater distances. Something very similar to Newton's law of gravity must hold. How does Isaac Newton know the inverse square law, that the moon orbit is due to gravity? He can measure the acceleration of an apple falling. He can measure the speed the moon is orbiting, since he is able to know its distance from the Earth and its motion across the sky. Centripetal acceleration with speed shows that the strength of the acceleration is smaller for the moon by the second power of its distance from Earth. Newton was not the only one in that period to notice this decreasing with the square of distance with celestial bodies. I'm speaking more in that school textbook form of simplified history. And the apple falling on his head is just a myth. But the moon is constantly falling toward the Earth like the apple, but it's also moving just enough to the side to never fall down, like a cannonball shot just right to keep curving around the Earth without coming down. So from that, Newton infers the inverse square law. Next, we know that the moons are going around Elanthia whether or not the whole solar system is heliocentrism. The equation for that motion is centripetal acceleration. It is purely geometry. When you combine that motion with proportional mass attraction in three-dimensional space, the mass of the orbiting body cancels out of both sides of the equation. When you rearrange the terms of the equation, you end up with Kepler's third law of motion, which defines the relationship between orbital radius and period. And so it is not arbitrary, it is a consequence of conditions. Physics can just as easily describe other kinds of universes as it can our own. With a different force law, Kepler's third law wouldn't happen. Generally, you do not get stable closed orbits with other force laws, which is called Bertrand's theorem. More specifically, a force field that depends only on radial separation is called a central force, such as we have with the attraction between masses. While any central force can have circular orbits, these are unnatural and will become unstable. If the central force is the same under rotations, it is a conservative force field. Without that property, you would not be able to define potential energy. Energy is not being conserved, which is a bad thing for orbits. You only get stable bound orbits always with central forces that are inverse linear or inverse square laws. Those are the only two, and any other force field, there may be only some closed orbits. The inverse linear law, the harmonic oscillator, is essentially the spring law. Kepler's third law only happens with the inverse square law. It's really that unforgiving. Einstein's gravity theory is not conservative in that narrow way, which is why Mercury's orbit is messed up in processing. But its deviation from Newtonian gravity is very small for ordinary situations of planetary orbits. If it was an inverse cube law added to the inverse square law, though, Newton showed you could have planets with different orbital speeds on the same closed orbit, that you could effectively multiply the speed on the same closed paths. More generally, the same radial motion with different angular speeds, up to the extreme case of spring-like oscillation, though it would require special conditions on their initial velocities. But with the inverse square law, we get Kepler's third law. It falls right out from the masses canceling. This is coming from the fact that inertial mass and gravitational mass are equivalent, essentially gravitational charge for the gravitational force, so it divides out. Imagine the electric force as contrast, where you have mass with centripetal acceleration on one side and the force law with electric charges on the other. When you divide mass through both sides, electric charge and inertial mass do not cancel out. Gravity is special in this way. It is called the equivalence principle. In the same place, at the same height, objects all accelerate at the same rate due to gravity, regardless of their mass, because it cancels out of the equation. In fact, even massless light is paradoxically deflected by Newtonian gravitational fields because the acceleration does not depend on its mass. Naively, that sounds like dividing by zero, but it's a limiting process of force getting smaller as mass gets smaller. You would use L'Hopital's rule from calculus. The gravitational acceleration is still constant. This leads down the path of interpreting gravity as geometry, which is what you see in Einstein's general relativity. So we have gravity, we have moons orbiting Elanthia periodically at distinct distances. This is implicitly of necessity a central force field. Now we run into the question, why are celestial bodies round? Stars, planets, large moons, all roughly spheres. The Earth is not a perfect sphere, its poles are squished. It is an oblate spheroid because of its rotation on its axis over very long timescales, which is to say it is shaped like a rotated ellipse rather than a rotated circle, much as would happen from spinning a fluid. Is Elanthia spinning? Yes. Is it made of perfectly rigid matter? No. Is Elanthia very old? Yes. That has consequences. Earth's northern and southern hemispheres are also slightly asymmetrical. The southern hemisphere is a bit wider than the northern, so vaguely pear-shaped, pear-Earth. Satellites can measure deviations from sphericalness with the small fluctuations they cause in the strength of gravitational acceleration. The surface of the Earth is also not perfectly smooth, very close but not quite. That is, compared to the scale of its radius, it is very smooth. But why does the world have to be almost spherical rather than, say, curved but elongated, like a carrot Earth? The biggest reason is that the gravitational force is radially symmetric, as I was saying before about rotational symmetry. There is a center of mass and a uniform pull in every direction. If you were way deep down inside a moon, only the mass of the imaginary sphere under you would contribute to gravity. So gravity gets weaker the closer you are to the center of mass. The rest of it cancels out. The gravitational pull, with the immense pressure it puts on the materials, makes the object gradually deform into a roughly spherical shape. Most asteroids are lumpy because they are not massive enough to make this deformation happen. They have to be at least several hundred miles wide. This is why the asteroid series is round. So, what would happen if the world was flat? There would be some gravity pointing down depending on the thickness of the world. If you're standing at the center of the flat sheet, that's all you would feel. But if you start traveling any other direction, horizontally you would also experience a horizontal gravitational force in addition to the vertical gravity. because the further to the edge you go, the more mass there is behind you, increasing the amount of gravity. We do not experience this on a round world because gravity is always pointing straight down. Something in orbit is always falling down. It's just that if it's in orbit, it's moving just fast enough horizontally that its elevation is never decreasing. Like a cannon firing increasingly further until eventually you have a cannonball circling the world. The atmosphere would also form a horizontal density gradient, concentrating around the center. You would suffocate traveling one way and get crushed traveling the other way. So you would need a very contrived notion of gravity to have a flat Elanthia. It would have to arbitrarily apply in some ways and not other ways. There need to be a pull only straight down for some reason, and the moon orbits would have to be unrelated to gravity, probably with various contrived ad hoc explanations for why things rotate as they do and why the tides happen. Maybe you go with the sun is really just foam riding across the sky. Ancient notions like the sun governs the day and the moon governs the night, rather than the sun being what causes the day and night. You would also need to come up with a way of making the moon phases happen without having the phases depend on where you're standing. Solid flat disks are also not stable in astronomy. It would only be able to form that shape by spinning very rapidly. James Clerk Maxwell calculated the rings of Saturn must be made up of separated debris, which as it turns out was right. If you were to flatten Earth into a disk, it would fairly quickly deform into a sphere, given its slow rotation rate. It would be torn apart if it was spinning fast enough to maintain the flat disk shape. Basically, rocks can only withstand so much pressure without deforming. Mountain heights above sea level are actually scale limited for this reason, between what rocks can withstand and a planet's gravity. It's called hydrostatic equilibrium. By the way, for a flat world to not lose its atmosphere to space, its disk walls would need to be several hundred miles high. But rock cannot withstand anywhere near that much pressure. Even steel will not be able to withstand it. We do not need to have any really detailed theory or understanding of matter to come to that conclusion. That matter deforms under sufficient force is empirically obvious in Elanthia. Another subtle point for the round world is the existence of cyclone patterns with clouds and weather. This one is a little iffy because easy examples like tornadoes, sorcerers, maelstroms, and so forth do not happen the same ways. Maelstrom is, or was originally, a small essence storm, which means its whirlwinds are a byproduct of magical phenomena. Consider this depiction of the mist swirling like a hurricane around Talon Isle. Is that purely natural? Probably not. Tornadoes spin the way they do because they are carrying through on the system that formed them. So they're going to tend to spin counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere because of the low pressure systems that form them. They're too small and brief to be directly forced that way, but they tend to go the way they started moving. It's like the hustlers who scam tourists out of money with bowls of water in countries near the equator. They move where they're standing, twist the bowl differently, making the water spin the opposite way, and then pass it off as demonstrating they just crossed the equator in that place. The relevant phenomenon is too weak to affect water in the bowl that way. But hurricanes would be big enough and long-lasting enough. The GMs have never really done a plain, good old-fashioned, normal Earth-style hurricane, tropical cyclone, typhoon, whatever you want to call them. But were such a thing to happen, they would also be spinning counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere and clockwise in the southern hemisphere. So this is one of those in-principle things that would be a way for Elanthians to tell from downstream consequences. What happens is something called the Coriolis effect, which is something called a fictitious force. It is seemingly a force that causes these clockwise and counterclockwise accelerations. But what's actually happening is that's an artifact of the frame of reference you're in being rotated around the Earth. Because the Earth is spinning, you're not really in an inertial reference frame. And that acceleration from the Earth's rotation has force-like consequences. The handedness of this is opposite in the opposing hemispheres, which makes the Coriolis effect produce opposite rotations. So if the NPCs could see tropical cyclones for Atlantis and contrast them with those hitting Phinia, they would be spinning opposite ways, which would be a consequence of the round world. Large-scale ocean currents called gyres, if I'm pronouncing that right, I might not be, would also display the Coriolis effect. except those would be clockwise in the northern hemisphere and counterclockwise in the southern, because the rotation is around higher pressure, whereas hurricanes are around lows, which ends up flipping the direction compared to the case of hurricanes. What about moons of moons? One of the most distinct aspects of Elanthia is that its moon Liabo has its own moons. Submoons have not been observed yet in the real world. There are none in our solar system. Maybe there are in other solar systems. There's been some theoretical sketching out if they are even possible at all. There was a paper a few years ago on it. The gist of it was that certain combinations of mass ratios and orbital radii might have stable orbits. They found that large moons on wide orbits might be capable of hosting submoons. But that is not Liabo. Liabo is close to Elanthia. Generally speaking, when you consider tiny Tiliac and tinier Mercury, it would take very little to eject those from their orbit. So let's look at the charts from that paper, which found there were only several moons that could hold submoons. Moons on the order of 1,000 kilometers can hold a submoon on the scale of 10 kilometers, provided the large moon is enough multiples away of the planet's radius. Earth's moon is 2.5 times farther away than Liabo, which shrinks the size of possible submoons for Liabo. If Liabo is capable of holding on to Tiliac, then Tiliac can only be a handful of miles wide. The ice version Tiliac, with its 20-mile radius, is too large for it. So maybe not impossible, but they'd have to be itty-bitty. Something interesting is that Tiliac and Mercury are in exactly the same orbit, not slightly offset, or else they would pass by each other, which would likely destabilize them. What is happening here is pretty subtle. With Mercury as the smaller object, and assuming Liabo is at least 25 times more massive than Tiliac, this is at least vaguely plausible. It would mean that the Liabo-Tiliac system is forming Lagrange points, which are special stable solutions for the three-body problem. The idea is that if Liabo is so much more massive, it is effectively acting as a fixed point, much as the Sun is effectively a fixed point for the Earth-Moon system. Then a significantly smaller object could remain with stability at the L4 or L5 Lagrange points around Tiliac. Tiliac orbiting Liabo was already hard-baked by Milgren's reach. Maybe that's why Mercury was made smaller than Tiliac. Mercury would be at the L5 Lagrange point, which would mean it is lagging behind Tiliac by 60 degrees. The OOC notes actually say Mercury is 60 degrees off from Tiliac. So that was almost certainly the intent. Some astronomy nerd did that on purpose, which implies Newton's laws hold for Atlantean celestial mechanics. And they obviously do in DragonRealms because those obey Kepler's laws. So that in itself implies the Sun is much more massive than the moons or Atlanthia itself. Otherwise, the conditions for this special orbit would be violated. That is, Tiliac and Mercury strongly imply heliocentrism in a very subtle way, with the Sun being very far away from Atlanthia and his moons. It is common for small objects like asteroids called Trojan asteroids to be found in the Lagrange points of planets, though I don't really buy it that submoons would be stable so close to Atlanthia, with Lornon as a disruption. Mercury would almost certainly have to be placed there artificially, which isn't really a problem all considering. It would likely be perturbed by other bodies into itself orbiting the Lagrange point. There's no stuff built up at the Earth-Moon L4 and L5 points, because lunar Lagrange points are weak. But who knows? More broadly speaking, when you're talking about Liabo, there are flows of essence and great magical powers involved. There's no telling how that might impact something like those submoons holding stable orbits, similar to how the flows of essence interact with the magnetic field in some complicated way in Shadow World. That sort of thing just isn't defined for the Atlantean world setting. With gravity working as gravity works, the Sun would have to be at the center of Elanthia's solar system, because that's where the center of mass would be. Things do not, strictly speaking, orbit the Sun. They orbit the center of mass, which is dominated by the Sun. Recall that solar eclipses with coronal rims are seen with at least the solar eclipse auction item, and the Sun must be much further away, so the Sun must be hugely larger. Though that is a magical effect, it's happening widely, perhaps too widely. Solar eclipses cut narrow paths. It isn't obvious to me that any of the moons are actually positioned and sized right for a solar eclipse to look that way. That's really a Goldilocks situation. It has to be just right. But it happens to be the case that the center of mass of our solar system is usually inside the Sun, depending on the relative positions of the several largest planets. But sometimes it's a little bit outside of the Sun, which wobbles as a result. Something a bit more subtle is that GemStone does have compass objects, which implies Elanthia has a navigable planetary magnetic field, which is only plausible if it's a stable magnetic dipole. Since Elanthia has volcanoes, it has molten liquid deep underground, where the metals are more dense and would sink down. Its rotation of the liquid metal, spinning the electric charges, would generate the planet's magnetic field. With high temperatures, materials lose their magnetic properties, so it comes from the rotation, where the magnetic field is generated perpendicular along the axis of rotation. Flat Elanthia, just spinning like a CD, for example, would have the magnetic north being straight up into the sky, which would make a compass useless for orienting direction. You would need to bend over backwards within plausibly just so conditions for a flat Elanthia to mimic our familiar magnetic field. But that is relatively arcane reasoning. It would just be very unnatural and weird for a flat world. We also know from the history of dwarves that there are lava flows deep under the Dragonspine Mountains. It is not merely a matter of fire elementals or volcano gods. Deep Elanthia is molten hot. In fact, the NPC authors of the Elementals document from 2002 say third echelon fire elementals go down into volcanoes, using them to travel to the very core of the world itself where they join their kin. The NPC author of Griffin Sword War also refers to the flames of the core of the world. Both sets of NPC authors are supposed to be scholars in the world setting. This wording makes no sense if Elanthia is considered flat. Flat disks have no core. There seems to be nothing anywhere suggesting continental drift. There isn't enough information to infer it. But it would not surprise me if Atlantis' southern subcontinent, the southern waste and all that, is another continental mass impacting and merging with Atlantis, forming the volcanic mountain range in the Southern Empire. That seems plausible, but I have no idea if it's intentional or not. Plate tectonics would at least be weird for a flat world. Something else are auroras, northern and southern lights. They are caused by the planet's magnetic field. With the addition of the Hinterwilds, there are auroras in the room painting, with that being the case of the northern lights. The same constellations would actually rotate circularly up there rather than rise up and disappear from the horizon. But that probably isn't depicted in the game. It's just what happens when you get near the poles. You move toward an equator, you will stop seeing some stars and start seeing new ones. There's an odd use of the word aurora on Liabo, stretching up to Tillac, suggesting that Liabo has auroras. Auroras are caused by magnetic fields, bringing charged particles down into atmospheres. Liabo seemingly has no atmosphere, though Tillac does. It's almost like it's streaming off Tillac. That is somewhat odd. Well, not that Liabo stripping gas from Tillac would be odd. It's actually weird that Tillac has an atmosphere at all. And Tillac should not really be a sphere unless it's a few hundred miles wide, which would be implausibly large for it as a submoon. But there was also a curtain of light phenomenon in the Liabo-Lornon conjunction with the Red Forest release, but that seemed to be more about lunar magical energies or even a mana storm effect than the northern lights, though not necessarily. Perhaps the lights were a downstream aurora effect. Bottom line, magnetic dipole with useful compasses and auroras strongly suggests the world is a rotating sphere, with a molten interior that produces a magnetic field because of the rotation. When they released the day-night system with the Vishmir event, there was some implication that this mage said the wrong word and made the world stop spinning. Accidentally said banish night. Slapstick end of GemStone's silliness, seriousness spectrum. Alistair has told me that was really an optical illusion, that it broke and rained the glacian orb objects everyone got back around that time period. Regardless, it was an example of a spinning or rotating Elanthia concept, for what that is worth. So there's certainly enough there to indicate attempts have been made to be astronomically correct. In fact, if you do the math, the celestial bodies in DragonRealms obey Kepler's laws, though you have to do it in seconds and ignore their 4x time compression. I'm told that it's just an artificial game mechanic to speed things up for moon mages, that it has no I.C.E reality. It isn't obvious that the planets are the same in GemStone because DragonRealms has a moon that doesn't exist in GemStone. The moon orbits are also totally different. The destruction of Mercury and Tilak is nowhere near enough to explain it. It would make more sense at this point to treat DragonRealms as one of the parallel universe Elanthias. You can actually see the crossing in the warp space in the Sorcerer Guild on Terrace Isle. But GemStone does have other planets which the NPCs know about, which are represented as spheres. The solar system of Elanthia appears to be heliocentric and understood that way. There is ample evidence that the world is considered round by NPCs in Elanthia, as well as ample evidence that the world actually is round. There's even some indication that the NPCs understand celestial mechanics, at least as far as Kepler's laws, though Elanthians probably do not have calculus in 18th century or later physics. If they did, there would be no reason for them to not have modern engineering. You start having world-setting modernity issues if they should have actual engineering rather than gnomish tinkering. Beyond a certain level of scrutiny, GemStone is not going to be internally consistent. It might be the case that Mercury is supposed to be at the L5 Lagrange point, for example, but then you have comic book stuff like implosion making bodies blow up, or metal making things more rather than less vulnerable to electricity, or the apparent lack of time zones, or any number of inconsistencies. The same game that lets you safely catapult over Black Swan Castle also kills you for jumping off the roof of Bonespear Tower. So there are limits on what you can plausibly infer with logic and puritanical realism. With GemStone, you ultimately have to let the different players who are playing at varying levels of immersion do their own things, because the game is never going to stick to a uniform level of seriousness. So, Flat Elanthia theorists, you're free to be wrong. Well, that's enough for this video. The final verdict is the world is round. So much for the Flat Elanthia Society. I've almost certainly overlooked a bunch of things, since there are thousands of rooms, but that's close enough. Thank you for watching my historical exploration series on the celestial heavens of GemStone. Hopefully you've learned something worth knowing, because then the Church of Core can burn you at the stake for heresy instead. That way I can pretend to recant and live to commit more heresies. Hey guys, if you want to see more of my fantabulous videos, be sure to click one of these links. But I warn you, it will put you at serious risk of becoming a huge nerd. Better train in that atomic wedgie C-man to brace yourselves. I mean, I'm assuming. Like I can be bothered to learn anything about the PSM review. Don't be a square.